such is also recognized by over 60% of the people as a stalwart and a cabinet we can rely on in terms of decency in public office. And that's not given out for free. We see the other figures all too often. What I meant to say is that UNDP works with 177 governments of the world, almost all governments of the world, and with very few do we feel so compenetrated, so aligned, and so gratified to be able to be of service. Second, and that's perhaps a little bit more personal, we like substantive leaders. Leaders who do evidence-based policy and evidence-based politics, leaders who value facts, figures, and realities. And you are, Minister, with a high profile, a frequent spokesperson for your government in media. Never do we read you or hear you say what the position is without speaking from a place of fact. And that's quite notable in politics nowadays. In a period of alternative reality and fake news, well, one has to value enormously the inclination towards truth and rigor and the good old facts and figures that are so important. And third, if I may, we also like to have you with us because we'd like to claim you as one of ours. In the UN family and in UNDP in particular. They say once UNDP, always UNDP. I hope this is the case. We recognize actually strokes and foundations of sustainable human development in your discourse and in your government action, and we couldn't be prouder of that legacy. So let me again thank you for being here, for accompanying our Regional Bureau Deputy Director, dear colleagues, Minister Marsha, Caddle, MP, Minister in the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Investment of the Government of Barbados. Madam, you have the floor.
Good morning. I have to say, Magdi, I'm going to take you with me to introduce me for every event because that was quite a fantastic, real heartfelt introduction, you know, without the ceremony, but really speaking to the common ground between the government of Barbados and the UN system. So thank you for that. Good morning, colleagues. I note from the tent cards that we're informal this morning. I love that. Please always call me Miss Marsha. That's great. And so I will just go right into introducing some of the thoughts that I want to share with you this morning. First, let me say I'm very sorry that I was late this morning. If you have not already heard, you may soon hear that we had a mass casualty event in Tweedside Road in St. Michael this morning, which is in my constituency. 7 people have been injured and many of them are still hospitalized. So forgive me if I am a bit distracted this morning. The area in Tweedside Road where it took place is directly opposite our office. It is a place where we lime and socialize and hang out a lot, and so you'll understand that many of those who were affected are really our family, and it has been quite a shock for us this morning. But I want to start this morning, and I note that I'm down to give a keynote speech, but this is a retreat. So I'm hoping that this is a conversation because that's what I prepared to have with you this morning. You may absolutely claim me as UNDP. As UN, I started first with, at the time, UNIFEM. I think that was in 2002. And over several years could never quite seem to get away from the UN system. One of the things that was in particular quite instructive and very dear to me, apart from the work with UNIFEM, now UN Women and UNDP, was also the work of our office in the forming of the methodology on the Human Development Index. And at that time, I think we were able to have a very important conversation about what that methodology means for the region. How is it that we make the region more visible in what we mean when we talk about human development, and why, as I will get into in my remarks later, middle or high income, or even middle and high human development can often mask some very important deficiencies or gaps or deprivations that human beings and communities and countries are experiencing. But I want to start this morning, as I'm sure you'll do in this opening session, with looking a little bit at the context in which UNDP is doing its work in Barbados and the region. And when we were involved in your meeting last week, when you were looking at the multi-country sustainable development framework, many of these issues came up. And I will just speak to them quite briefly, but obviously it's important to set that context and to always understand the context in which this work is being done. And it is one that is dynamic. And I think that that's one of the things that makes the work that you do here in Barbados so important, because you are close to the action. And you have an advantage that some of your colleagues in other regions don't necessarily have, because it is a small region. It is easily accessible, relatively so. And you are on the ground. You are close to the action. I believe, certainly over the last 18 months, we've begun to cultivate in the government of Barbados a culture of accessibility. And if there's something you want to know, if there's something on which you want to collaborate, please ask. And so that's important, because that helps inform work, I would say, not just for Caribbean SIDS, but also for SIDS in the Pacific, and for the global work that UNDP is doing. But I do want to say a little bit about the context, and in order to speak to that context, of course I'm going to make reference to Barbados and what we have been going through. I remember some years ago, UNDP commissioned what I believe was the beginning of very important work, and it had to do with looking at debt in the region, how it really affects countries' capacity to do development work, things like the composition of the debt, the debt stock, the interest payments, all of these things that UNDP wanted to help Barbados and the region understand and work through issues of what is sustainable debt? What are the kinds of decisions countries should make when it comes to what they borrow for? So it's not just the size of the debt that's important, but its composition. What is the real return from your investment in the things for which you borrow? And I thought that was a very important conversation at the time, and it is one that in Barbados we have returned to. As you know by now, we went through a pretty comprehensive debt restructuring. Last year we closed our domestic debt exchange quite successfully. And recently, we also launched our external debt exchange. And you've heard us discuss what that has meant. It has meant that we reduced our debt from 176% debt to GDP, which was the third highest in the world, and got down to, on the day of the exchange, which was December 11th, 118% debt to GDP, and falling by the time we close. Now, we have, in this debt exchange, had some unparalleled success, I don't mind saying. And it's not to boast, but it is to demonstrate the power of solidarity, which is one of the messages I hope to leave with you this morning. We got supermajorities across the 4 debt instruments that we launched for the exchange. And that is to say that the take-up has varied from about 85% with one of the instruments to up to mid-90s for the others, and 100% on 2. And that means really that people have decided to bet on Barbados. They've decided to believe us when we say that we are serious about our restructuring. They've decided to believe us when we say that this default was a one-off that was born out of necessity, that we, as a country, would never have thought that we would have been here, but that we were. And we had to make a bold decision, and we did. And so the message of solidarity is really that, one of the things we say about what Barbados is going through is that this adjustment has been one of the most shared in history. We said early on that we did not intend at all for labor to bear the brunt of the adjustment. We, understanding the social content of macroeconomic policies, we understood that Barbados could not survive a structural adjustment where 5 or 6 or 7 or 10,000 people were separated from their work and their livelihoods. And we decided that it had to be shared across labor and capital, and happily, and that's a strange word to use in the circumstances, but happily, Barbadians believed that. Barbadians bet on their country and on solidarity. And that's why between labor and capital, we were able to share that adjustment. It does not mean that there were no negative effects. It does not mean that we do not have a lot of work to do to make sure that all of our tools and our policy instruments are put to use to make sure people's lives are made better and no one slips off the radar or slips through the cracks. It does not mean that there have been no losers. It means that we have tried our very best to make sure that those who could least stand to lose are not the biggest losers. And that's been important to us as a government in this adjustment. It was one that we needed to do, but it was one that we wanted to make sure that people understood, that we walked the country with us through, and that we're able to minimize as far as we can the effects of that adjustment that we would not want people to experience or to experience for too long. But the question of solidarity is one that it's not just about how the country responded and how even our external creditors responded by betting on Barbados. It was also the way that we went about coming up with our development work. And we talk a lot about the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Plan, and a lot of the focus is on the recovery part. My focus really is on the transformation, because I've said many times that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. While we never wanted Barbados to find itself where we found ourselves 18 months ago, it also gave us an opportunity to reset, to go back to basics, go back to first principles, to look at our values, our collective values, and to make some decisions about what is important to us as a people and as a government. And so this has given us the opportunity to do just that. One of the things it allowed us to do was to re-emphasize and rebuild our relationship with the social partnership. Now, the social partnership model of governance in Barbados is one where labor, the private sector, and government, and now civil society with the introduction of our Social Justice Committee, have a say in how decisions are made in the name of the people of Barbados. And I do not believe that we would have come to where we are today, or that we would feel so strong on our journey if we did not have that approach to governance. It is not about 26 or 30 people in a room or in a parliament or in a cabinet conference room. It is about making sure that as many voices as possible are heard, and not just heard, not just that you speak and then we say thank you very much, but that people's feelings and thoughts and ideas are reflected in policy. And obviously, you will not be able to satisfy every single person, but we want to make sure that in this true spirit of democratic governance, that people feel a part of the decisions that are being made. And so I would say that for this government of Barbados, governance through consultation and solidarity has been what has been very important for us. Governance as well, as Maggie said, through evidence is important. And that's why the work of UNDP has been really fundamental in the region. I don't mind saying that I was a part of UNDP when we started working in the region on the multidimensional poverty index, and I see one of my colleagues who's keeping up the good fight is still here with you. But this kind of work is so important. It is important in particular in middle and high income countries and regions. You know, when I came to UNDP, I started to think of the year, but I don't want to do that. So I'll just say when I came to UNDP, it was in a moment when the then resident representative said, and she said this to me after, but it was perhaps something that was not said much at the beginning. She said that, you know, I wanted an economist to be able to work on issues of poverty reduction. I came to manage the poverty reduction program. And it's not to say that only an economist can, obviously not, but it is to be able to send a message that economics is about the provisioning of goods and services to people for the improvement of their well-being. It is not about numbers, although regrettably we have to manage some of those, but it is really about matching people's well-being and access to opportunities with economic policy. And one of the things I said to Michelle at the time was, you know, in a middle-income region, to have a portfolio that is called poverty reduction is going to be a very hard sell. And when I came in, the poverty reduction portfolio didn't have a lot of money because after all, we were in Barbados, we were in the Eastern Caribbean, and the fact is that when people think about this region, they don't think about poverty and poverty reduction. And I said to her, how about we rename this and we call it poverty reduction and economic security? Because if we shift the conversation to one that is about economic security, it becomes a whole different discussion. And I'll tell you what I mean. We, of course, in this room all understand that poverty, again, is not static. That it is a life cycle issue. That I may be non-poor today by your income measurement. I may be poor according to other deprivations, like access, my children's access to affordable education or to affordable health care. But I may also be non-poor today, either in income measures or in non-income measures. But I may be poor tomorrow. I may have some kind of shock to my household economy. I may lose a job. I or somebody in my household may lose a job. I or someone in my household may become ill, such that my care becomes very expensive, and then I'm poor. And so the idea that in a region like this, you can just measure income poverty and walk away and say, okay, well, that's only 10%, or that's only 16%, or that's only, is really an oversimplification of all of the things that affect people in this subregion. That's why the work on multidimensional poverty, led by UNDP, has been so, and now appearing in the work that the Caribbean Development Bank is doing in its poverty measurement, has been so critical. But it's also why advocacy by UNDP about what it means to be a middle income or high income small island developing state is so important. Because just as it is not about income poverty at one snapshot in time, similarly, it is not just about GDP per capita of a country. And we saw that with what Barbados has just been through. We see that you can have high GDP per capita and you can have unsustainable levels of debt such that you can essentially invest in nothing. You can't invest in people, you can't invest in infrastructure, and before long, that GDP per capita is going to stand for nothing at all. Because what we saw in Barbados was that because of the unsustainable levels of debt, because of the high deficit, the fact is that there was almost zero fiscal space to be able to invest in all of those things that you measure in the Human Development Index. And we saw the fallout from that. We see what it means when you fail to invest in institutions, because people lose confidence in those institutions. When you fail to invest in infrastructure, those of you who had the misfortune of living on the South Coast during that period, and your office is in fact on the South Coast, would understand what it looks like and smells like when you fail to invest in infrastructure. And failing to invest in communities and people is perhaps the worst effect of that kind of constraint in your fiscal space. And we are seeing some of the effects of that today. It was quite the shock for me, and I want to say in the last couple minutes I have at the end a little bit about the transition from this development space and all of the luxury of thought that it affords and transitioning to government. And I know some of my colleagues who were there at the time did the opposite. They transitioned from government into the UN system, and that also has its lessons. But I want to say that it is important to be able to make visible the issues that small and developing states have that affect their access to resources. Now, this is a standing argument that all of you in this room probably know, that we've been making the case for years about the issue of vulnerability of small and developing states. And quite frankly, the direction of the narrative has not gone in our favor. If you look around, you'll see globally there seems to be less and less regard for the issue of small size. And we know that multilateralism is under threat. We know that we have to protect ourselves and make our own country and region sustainable. But there is a role for UNDP to continue to play, to use evidence, research, new measures of vulnerability and what it looks like, to be able to say GDP per capita is not the way to understand what is happening at the national, community, and household level. You did it with the Multidimensional Poverty Index. And now that has to be scaled up to the macro level. And some of the things we understand. So one of the measures that we have looked at, and CDB is also doing some work in this regard, has to do with a country's capacity to adapt to technology. And it is a very real metric. Has your education system, or does your education system allow for the average citizen to have access or to easily adapt to new technology or even to create technology? Now, this region has extremely high costs of transport. And more, the kinds of goods and services we need to create are those that don't necessarily have to go to the port and wait for a ship to come, because we all know as well that if there is a particularly active hurricane season, that your exports are going to be affected. Really, what you need to be able to do is to be able to create goods and services that are based on high skills, high levels of knowledge, and technological capacity. Countries like those in the region have to be able to do that. And so one of those measures of vulnerability, one of those measures that might be more useful than GDP per capita is, does your country, Barbados, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Antigua and Barbuda, does this country have the base of knowledge to be able to adapt to technology and to be able to use it to grow? I would suggest that that is one that you may consider. But the other that we've been considering very much, and someone will let me know, please, when I'm running out of time. One of the ones that we've considered very much is the issue of climate change and disaster risk management. Now, years ago, the work that we did with respect to climate and disaster was really based on forecasting. We were trying to guess what would happen. We were trying to guess what would be the percent of loss and damage to economies. But now, we no longer have to guess. We no longer have to forecast because we have, regrettably, so much evidence from the region. And where before we used to see losses in the area of 10% of GDP, 20% of GDP, climate change means that what are you now seeing? You're seeing 220% in the case of Dominica after Maria. And this is growing. Now we know that this scale of loss and damage is essentially uninsurable in its totality. But recently, the government of Barbados convened an insurance colloquium to look at what role can insurance play and what role can other kinds of instruments play. We know two things. One is that we need access to liquidity, high levels of liquidity after an event. But where we can perhaps concentrate a bit more is what we need before the event. And what we need is investment in resilience. When I talk about resilience, I'm not just talking about how deep you dig the foundation or how thick the walls are. I'm talking about every sector being resilient. So you need resilient infrastructure. And I say that Barbados is entirely coastal. There are no coastal areas. Barbados is a coastal country. So you're talking about investment in infrastructure and flexible approaches to that investment in infrastructure. But you're also talking about making your networks resilient. You're talking about making sure that you can get back to, once you've secured people's safety, once you've taken care of the basic things like making sure people are well and safe and healthy and have access to medicine and security, that you can get back to business. Because a high percentage of losses from severe weather events and hurricanes and so on comes from not being able to get immediately back to economic activity. And so you want to be able to build resilience in before the fact. Now, the government of Barbados certainly doesn't have the resources, and I'm sure no government in the region currently has the resources for the scale of the investment that is required to be able to build resiliently across the infrastructural capacity of the country. It needs to be done in partnership with the private sector. But how do you send the message that there are returns to be had from investing in resilience in a country? And one of the ways to do that is through resilience bonds. And that is one of the financial instruments that we're currently working on, to be able to structure an instrument that has really, as we would say in Barbados, kills two birds with one stone. Although nobody should be killing any birds and affecting the biodiversity. But it allows you to do two things. One is it allows you to actually build in the resilience that is going to make the investors, other of their investments, pay off in the long run. Because if you have built a hotel or some other entity on an island, you want to make sure that it is safe, that your business can return to economic activity thereafter, and so it is in your interest to invest in resilience. You want to send a signal that there is a return from so doing, that is a specific monetary return. Because the challenge with investing in resilience is that you see the returns at the national level across society, but how do you make sure that there are financial returns to the investor? But the other is that it also gives you an opportunity for people to invest in something that benefits them. And so if you structure, for example, a growth bond or resilience bond, it means that you're taking those almost 10 billion in savings that we have in Barbados, almost 50 billion in the CARICOM region, and you are directing them to the areas of investment that matter for the country and that ultimately matter for citizens. So this is some of the work that we've been doing. And I know that UNDP and the UN system continue the work on climate and disaster. In fact, I made a note this morning when I was thinking about what I would say today. And I wasn't sure if I should share it, but I will. It is that UNDP has been, in many ways, I see Marlon in here somewhere, yes, and Danielle, among the leaders in looking at how we use technology, how we use networks, early warning systems, and so on. What does it mean for this region to really build resilience? You all have led that. And when I first came to UNDP and realized that they were essentially asking me, excuse me if I get a bit indelicate, but this is a retreat. They were essentially asking me to program and spend about $5 in real terms in poverty reduction. I said, but this is not going to get you the mileage. Doing these small projects that are really just meant to address kind of small community issues, that's not the way to get the kind of scale that these countries need to be able to address citizens' deprivations and access to opportunity. And what we jointly determined at that time, and I was very privileged to be part of a very creative team. One of the things we realized at that time was that climate and climate change is a poverty issue. It is a development issue in the sense that the poor are least able to adjust and to adapt and have the most to lose with respect to their livelihoods. And what we were able to do was be able to mobilize resources for this area of work, this area of economic security, that came from the climate change and climate finance space. And it was something that UNDP led in doing, and it is something that I hope that you will continue to build on your own visibility and thought leadership in that area, because you are among the first to understand and to send a message that issues of climate change affect the poor in ways that it does not affect other segments of the population, and to start to come up with creative ways of addressing that. I want to emphasize that we are not going to get to the real development challenges of countries in Barbados and the OECS if we do not speak very clearly to what those specific challenges are and what the drivers are and what those experiences look like. And if we also do not find the resources where they are, even though they may not be, the language attached to those resources may not be language that naturally matches your areas of work, but it is all about development and opportunity. And I hope you continue to do that work. I want to say in my remaining time that, and I've spoken in the multi-country sustainable development framework meetings about what is UNDP's advantage, and that's something that every institution, every entity looks at. Given the resources that are available. One of those, of course, has to do with policy and thought leadership, and being able to help the countries that your client countries answer fundamental questions that will allow them to develop policy. That requires you to be very close to where the thinking is happening, and to be able to be flexible, to be able to answer the phone and say, we understand that you want to know this, and we're going to help you figure it out. Because if you're looking at what are some of the gaps in governments, one of those is really to have the space to be able to do a lot of the research. And it's not that this research capacity doesn't ordinarily obtain, it is that governments will always also find themselves sometimes with reduced capacity for that, depending on what's going on in the country. It might be that they're dealing with a weather event. It might be that they're dealing with an economic crisis. And so I think one of the advantages, one of the roles that UNDP can play is to do research that is specific to the country context. We know that we all have the corporate direction and what is of interest to UNDP globally and what are the emerging areas of research. I think the key and where you add value to governments is to be able to bring that down to what is happening on the ground in the country, in the client country that you're serving. Because we have a lot of global and even regional with respect to Latin America and the Caribbean or the Americas. We have a lot of that information. What we have less of is information that is specific to the country. And what I'm talking about is answers to questions, not just general data, but to understand what the question is so that you can help governments come up with the answers. One of the other areas I would say around the Sustainable Development Goals has to do as well with means of implementation. And I think that countries, certainly in the region and certainly for Barbados, have bought into the importance of having goals, having targets and indicators, and being able to work toward those. Countries are constrained, however, in the resources, as we all know. And so in order to hold countries accountable for the SDGs, I think the UN system and the international development community also has to support the means of implementation. And what I mean by that is to be able to mobilize resources from non-traditional sources that governments don't already have access to. So we don't want to compete with you to execute resources from those sources that we already have access to. We would like your support in helping us identify resources, both financial and technical, that we may not necessarily know about, but that you may be close to because of your work. And so that is a very important role I believe UNDP has to play, because having the framework means nothing without the means of implementation. And that is one of the lessons that we've learned from the Millennium Development Goals and from the entire process of coming up with with internationally agreed development goals. And of course, and I've made this point before, there's also data. And we also cannot report on how countries are doing with the SDGs unless we have the basic data infrastructure. And I say basic because, you know, one of the things I realize in the transition is one of the things that you always suspected, but it's a completely different thing when you are there doing the work, is that countries and their institutions sometimes have ebbs and flows in their capacity. And statistical offices and those who generate data have a basic level, a basic set of surveys and so on that they need to execute. And so countries will always need to do a census, they will always need to do a labor force survey and so on. And national accounts and all of these basic things. And what you will find is that a country that is struggling to be able to meet those commitments to actually fulfill its mandate is going to struggle even more to be able to report in these ways that often the UN system is looking for. And so they need that support. They need that support, first of all, to build out the basic infrastructure for being able to generate information. And further, they need that support to be able to report on how they're doing it. And that's why I'm very excited about the partnership that we've initiated for Barbados to do its voluntary national report on the SDGs, because with the support of UNDP and the UN system, because these kinds of opportunities allow countries to take stock to have honest conversations about how they're doing and to see what the gaps are. But it is important to be able to continue to support countries' capacity because we do have several competing mandates at once. And finally, I want to say a little bit about how it has been to make the transition from development space to having to get things done on behalf of citizens of a country. And perhaps this, the biggest lesson for me in terms of what about that transition might be relevant for you today has to do with the extent to which you need to really tailor support to government systems and how government functions. There will be space to also strengthen how government functions. But I think that what happens often is that we have a notion of what our ideal system looks like. If everything were working perfectly in national governance, what would we be able to bring to bear? And that is never the case. And I'm not sure that it should be, and I'll say what I mean. Governance is about priorities. Governance is about choices. And I believe that it's important to be able to, as a UN system, as the international development community, to be able to see and understand exactly where countries are in a particular objective and to be able to fill the gaps that exist. I think that we have an idea as international development practitioners about what is important at the global level and at the regional level. But I think it's also important to understand the dynamics at play on the ground every day in a country, in a community. I think it's important in particular to understand really what people are experiencing. When I first came to UNDP, we were doing some community-based work. And the value of that was that you understood exactly how policies were impacting people on the ground every day and what it would mean then for how you might need to shift or correct or adjust. And the same is true for having the privilege of representing a constituency of people, as well as having to determine policy. Because you get to see the evidence of how that is working or not working. And I think that there can be no replacement for that. In my final thoughts, I want to return to the issue and the notion of solidarity. And not just how the UN system works with governments, works with other non-governmental organizations, but how you work with each other. I think that perhaps the strongest lesson for me being a part of UNDP, and perhaps where I got the greatest opportunity, was to be able to understand how every area of work, however you're organized, whether you're organized according to disaster response or governance or sustainable development, being able to realize that it only matters when you're able to work together because it is a common outcome that you're working towards. And I know that that's part of why you are here over these next 2 days, is it? To be able to understand that, one, the corporate and the administration is there to make the development work. You can't have one without the other. And two, that these separations that you make in your work are so that you can organize your work properly, but that really is about development. That it is all about giving people access to opportunities and also removing the constraints that people have to those opportunities once they are created. So I want to wish you the best over the next 2 days. As I look around the room, there is a sense of nostalgia, I will admit. I think that I want to reinforce for all of you that UNDP is doing valuable work, and that your ability not just to continue that work, to make it visible, to make your messages visible, to make your ideology and your philosophy of why you are doing this work much more visible, but also to make sure that you are able to embrace young people as equals who also feel that they have a place in contributing to this work. When I joined UNDP, we were a reasonably young office. We had, at the time, what the Cabinet of Barbados now has, good experience with some youthful energy. And that is always important. I want you to continue, because I've seen its value, to embrace young people in not just observing, but doing. Because that is where they understand the value of their thoughts and ideas and their energy. And so thank you for the opportunity to be a part of your retreat, and I wish you a successful one over the next 2 days.